My name is Linda Whitaker, and I used to think I understood people better than most. Not because I was smarter, not because I was more perceptive, but because my work taught me how. 8 years in the Marine Corps, you learn to read people. You learn to recognize who is afraid but hiding it, who is lying but has started to believe their own lies, who is genuinely strong and who is only performing strength. You learn to read a person in 3 seconds: posture, eye contact, the way they breathe when they're under pressure. Those skills saved my life more than once. I was proud of them. And then my grandfather died, and I realized I hadn't understood a single thing about him. Not part of him. Not most of him. All of him. Everything I thought I knew about Edward Whitaker, the man I had seen every Christmas for the first 18 years of my life, the man who sat in his worn armchair and smoked his pipe and stared out the window, all of it was only the shadow of a real person I had never actually met. That didn't make me feel ashamed. It made me feel something closer to grief. To understand this story, you need to understand the Whitaker family first. My father, Robert Whitaker, was the kind of man the neighbors called successful. Not in an extravagant way. In the ordinary Ohio way. A spacious house, a well-trimmed yard, a new car every 4 years, 2 kids in good schools, and a steady engineering job at an automotive parts factory in Columbus. My father believed in hard work the way it can be measured. Meaning you need evidence. Meaning you need something you can point to and say, this, I built this. My mother, Patricia, everyone called her Pat, taught high school mathematics. She liked order. She liked when things made sense. 2 + 2 = 4, not 3.5, not approximately 4, but precisely and always 4. That was her worldview, and she applied it to everything, including people. In that worldview, Grandfather Edward didn't add up to anything. He had no degree, no clearly defined profession, or at least not one my parents could explain to friends at a dinner party. When I was small, I heard my father say, he did some kind of government work before, in the tone of someone who doesn't really know but doesn't want to admit they don't know. As I got older, that line gradually became, he never really did anything. And the distance between those two versions was never explained. Grandmother Martha died when I was 4. I have no real memory of her. Only a photograph of her laughing on a beach, hair caught in the wind, and the sunlight making her eyes look amber. After she died, Grandfather Edward lived alone in a small house on the outskirts of Dayton. My parents visited him twice a year, Thanksgiving and Christmas, sometimes Easter if they had nothing else planned. Those visits, in my memory, all had the same color. A table full of food that nobody was really hungry for, conversation about weather and school and work, and my grandfather sitting at the head of the table with his glass of water, contributing nothing beyond brief answers when directly asked. On the drive home, my father would say, he's doing fine. And that was the summary. He's fine. Not worse. Not better. Just fine, the way you check something off a list and move on. I grew up believing that Edward was simply that kind of person. An ordinary man with nothing particular to say, someone who had lived his life without leaving a mark. I didn't think poorly of him. I just didn't think about him much. That, I later came to understand, is one of the worst things you can do to a person, not to hate them, not to love them, but simply to not think of them at all. My clearest childhood memory of my grandfather happened when I was about 9 years old. It was a summer afternoon, and I was playing in his backyard. His yard was nothing like ours. No neatly trimmed flower beds, no stone fountain, no white plastic lawn furniture. His yard grew on its own terms. Unnamed shrubs, moss-covered rocks, and an old apple tree in the corner that dropped small sour fruit every autumn. I was trying to climb that apple tree. I slipped and fell. It didn't hurt much, scraped knee, dirty jeans, but I cried because the fall had startled me, and because I felt a little embarrassed. Grandfather Edward came outside. He sat down on the ground beside me, a man in his mid-60s, lowering himself to the earth like it was the most natural thing in the world, and he looked at my knee. Not deep, he said. Then silence. I wanted him to say something reassuring. You're okay, or brave girl, or anything like that. But he didn't. He just sat there, and after a moment he pointed at the tree and asked, what did you want to see from up there? I wanted to see what the neighborhood looks like from high up. He nodded as though that were a perfectly serious answer. Then he stood, stretched his back and said, second branch from the bottom on the right side. That's where you put your foot first. Not the first branch. The first one is weak. Then he went back inside. I looked at the tree. Then I climbed it. This time I didn't fall. From up in the apple tree, I could see the whole street, rooftops, patches of yard. Another kid riding a bike far down the road. I sat in the branches and felt something I would later recognize as pride. Not the kind someone gives you, but the kind you discover in yourself when you do something you thought you couldn't. He hadn't praised me. He hadn't watched to see if I made it. But he had told me which branch to trust. I didn't understand what that meant at the time. Now I do. That was his language, not the language of reassurance and encouragement, but the language of someone who believed the best thing you could do for a person was show them how to do something themselves, then step back and let them do it. The ring. I need to talk about the ring early because it's present in every memory I have of him. A question mark I never quite found the courage to ask about honestly. The metal ring on the fourth finger of Edward's left hand was not beautiful in any conventional sense. Not gold. Not bright silver. A gray metal whose color was ambiguous in ordinary light. Sometimes it looked like aged silver, sometimes something darker, as though its color shifted depending on the angle. The surface had been worn smooth by time and by the hand that had always worn it, worn the way things are when they are never taken off. On the face of the ring was a symbol. I had looked at it hundreds of times in my life and could never quite describe it accurately. Not a letter. Not simple geometry. Something like an eye and a vertical blade intersecting, surrounded by small etched lines that resembled script but were not any writing I recognized. When I was 6, I asked him, "Is that your wedding ring?" He looked at me, then at the ring. "No." "Then what kind of ring is it?" "A remembering ring." "What does it remember?" He didn't answer immediately. He looked out the window for a long time. Then he said, "People who deserve to be remembered." I didn't understand that at 6. I thought it was the kind of vague answer adults give when they don't want to explain something. I didn't ask again. His wedding ring, yes, he had one, the slender gold band he and Martha had exchanged in 1958. That ring had been in the nightstand drawer since the day she died. He never wore it again. He put it away the way you put away something too precious to wear every day, or too painful to see each morning. But the gray metal ring, he wore that every day, never removed it, from the earliest morning I can remember until the day they took him to the hospital. I joined the Marine Corps at 18, the summer after high school graduation. My father didn't speak to me for 2 weeks after I announced the decision. Not because he was angry in the way that involves raised voices or fists on tables. Because he was disappointed in the way of someone who had built a very careful plan in his head, and was now watching it collapse without anyone having consulted him. My mother cried. Not once but in waves throughout that whole summer. When I submitted my application. When it was accepted. When I went to buy gear. And a final longest time on the early morning I walked out the door. My younger brother Daniel, 15 at the time, stood at the gate watching me with a look somewhere between admiration and fear. The expression of someone witnessing another person do what they themselves couldn't imagine doing. Grandfather Edward called me the evening before I left. "You've decided?" "Yes, sir." "Good." A pause. "Remember this. In any team, the most important person is not the one who talks the most or stands highest. The most important person is the one who stays calm when everyone else is losing it. You need to become that person." I didn't know what to say. "Calm doesn't mean not afraid," he continued. "Calm means afraid and still able to do what needs doing." Then he said, "Good luck," and hung up. At the time I thought it was the generic advice of an old man. I didn't know he was speaking from experience. 8 years in the Marine Corps, I can't tell everything that happened in those 8 years. Not because of restrictions, though some things still are, but because certain experiences don't have language precise enough to hold them. But I can tell some things. I can tell you about the first time I had to make a decision under fire, when everything was happening too fast and your mind is trying to process 15 variables simultaneously, and you know that if you're wrong, the people who pay for it won't only be you. In that moment you discover something about yourself. Not whether you're brave or not, but whether you can trust yourself. I can tell you about long nights in the desert when the temperature dropped until the air seemed to thicken, and you lay in your sleeping bag listening to silence and knowing silence isn't always safe. In those nights you learn to live with uncertainty. Learn to keep breathing and thinking when you don't know what the next hour holds. I can tell you about the people I served with, people I ate with, slept beside, trusted in situations where trust wasn't a choice but a survival mechanism. Some of those people I no longer see because life scatters people because of reassignments and because of other reasons I'd rather not name. And I can tell you about the most important thing those 8 years taught me: the difference between reputation and actual worth. In the military, you meet all kinds: people who are good and know it and say so, and people who are good and simply don't care whether anyone knows it. They just do what needs doing, do it well, and move on. After a while, you learn to tell the difference. And you learn that the second kind is almost always more trustworthy. But I still hadn't applied that lesson to my own grandfather. Not yet. In those 8 years, I visited Grandfather Edward almost never. Not completely without time. I just didn't prioritize it. Didn't put it on the list of things that mattered. I called on holidays. He answered briefly. I asked how he was, he said fine. I asked if he needed anything, he said no. The conversation ended after 3 to 5 minutes and I moved on to whatever I had decided was more important. I visited him exactly twice in 8 years. Twice. Each time for less than a day. Then my father called. Grandpa's in the hospital. Pneumonia. The doctors say it's serious. My father's voice, I had heard him say many things over the years, and I knew the difference between the voice he used when he was genuinely worried and the voice he used when he was reporting procedure. This was the procedure voice. That made me sad in a way I didn't fully understand at the time. Are you and Mom going up? I asked. A brief silence. Your mother has a major project deadline. I have back-to-back meetings all week. See if you can get away. I checked my mental calendar. I was between deployments. I had no assignment. Nothing more urgent than a man who was sick and possibly dying. I'll go, I said. Dayton, Ohio in October has the damp cold of the Midwest. Not the sharp cold of mountain country, but the slow kind that seeps in, the kind you don't notice until it's already in your bones. I drove from the base to Ohio alone. 6 hours on the highway thinking about things I hadn't yet made time to think about. I stood outside room 412 with my hand on the door handle for a full minute before I pushed it open. Grandfather Edward lay in the hospital bed, smaller than I remembered. People say that about old people when they're sick, that they become small. But not in the way of weakness. In the way of someone whose body has finished what it came to do and is returning the rest, giving back what is no longer needed. He opened his eyes when he heard the door. Those pale blue eyes. In my memory, his eyes had always looked toward something far away. Past the window, past your shoulder, toward some place you couldn't follow. But now they looked directly at me. Clear. Fully present. You came, he said. Not a question. Not quite a greeting. A simple acknowledgement, as calm as recognizing that the sun rose on time. I sat in the chair beside the bed and took his hand. The hand was thin, skin loose, veins raised like rivers on a map. But when I held it, I felt something beneath the surface. A memory of strength. Not the strength of muscle, but the strength of a hand that had held many things, had gripped and not let go even when it could have. The metal ring was still there. We sat in silence for a while. Not uncomfortable silence. The silence of two people who don't need to speak to know that the other's presence is enough. Then he asked, "Are you still in?" "Yes, sir." "Good." A pause. He looked at the ceiling. "Do you like it?" That question stopped me. Nobody had asked it to me that way. Not is it hard, not is it dangerous, but do you like it? As if what mattered most was whether I was doing what I wanted to be doing. "Yes," I said honestly. "Not every day. But I know it's where I'm supposed to be." He nodded. Slowly. "Knowing where you belong, that's rare." I wanted to ask him whether he had known where he belonged. But I didn't. And I've regretted that since. I stayed 3 weeks. I remember those 3 weeks more clearly than almost any 3 weeks in my life. Every morning I arrived early, bought coffee from the machine in the hallway, the worst coffee in the world, palest-colored water, and sat beside his bed until the nurses came for their morning rounds. Every afternoon I came back after lunch. Every evening I stayed until the end of visiting hours. We talked more than we had talked in all the years before combined. Mostly small things. He asked about the places I'd been. I told him carefully, leaving out what couldn't be told. And he listened in the way of someone who doesn't just hear with their ears but with their whole body, nodding in the right places, going quiet in the places that called for quiet. One afternoon near the end, he spoke when I thought he was asleep. "Linda, I'm here. Are you afraid? In your work?" I thought before answering. "Yes." Not always the shaking kind, but there's always something there. Something I call respect for what might happen. He nodded. Good. People who don't know fear are dangerous. Not to enemies, to the people beside them. A silence. Were you ever afraid? I asked, not knowing why I dared. He looked at the ceiling for a very long time. Then he said, I was afraid of many things, but not of dying. Then what were you most afraid of? A longer silence. Afraid of doing the right thing but not enough of it. Of looking back and seeing I was in the right place, doing the right thing but not enough. Not fast enough, not careful enough, not enough to keep everyone. He paused. Not everyone. I didn't fully understand that then. I understood it later. The last morning he spoke to me clearly. Winter sunlight came through the window at a low angle and pressed pale yellow squares onto the hospital floor. I was reading and he was looking at those squares of light, and I had the sense he was thinking about something very far away. Then he turned and looked at me. Linda. Yes, Grandpa. You're a good person. His voice had no trace of sentimentality or social courtesy. He said it the way you state something that has been verified. I've watched you since you were small. I see it. I didn't know what to say. So are you, I said finally. And for the first time in my life I saw him smile. Not a polite smile, not a reflex smile, but the smile of someone who has just set down something very heavy they have been carrying for a very long time. 3 days later at 3:15 in the morning my phone rang. A nurse. Edward Whittaker's funeral was held on a Wednesday, in cold drizzle under a gray sky. 7 people. I counted. 7 people for 81 years of living. My parents, me, 2 elderly neighbors, a middle-aged woman I didn't know, and an old man in a felt hat standing apart under a tree at the edge of the cemetery. The old man in the felt hat. I noticed him because he stood separate from the group, spoke to no one, and just stood with his arms folded across his chest watching the coffin. When the service ended, he walked away before anyone else, quickly and silently, like someone who had done what he came to do and had no reason to stay. I watched his figure until it disappeared beyond the tree line. I didn't know who he was. I would find out later. But in that moment I only knew that this man had come to Edward Whittaker's funeral the way you come when you understand exactly why you are there. Clearing out my grandfather's house took 3 days. My father had arranged for a company to come move the furniture. I asked to go through alone first, room by room, drawer by drawer, reading the life of a man I had known all my life and never really known at all. Books, more than I expected. Military history, geography, a few philosophy texts from East Asia, several in Russian and German, and one language I couldn't place at all. He read multiple languages? I hadn't known that. A small filing cabinet in the corner of the living room. Empty. Not always empty, but carefully emptied. The drawers held only ordinary things. Utility bills, health insurance papers, bank statements. Nothing about previous employment. Nothing about the years before he came to Dayton. As if that part of his life had simply never existed. In the bedroom. A single bed, a wardrobe of plain clothes folded with a precision I recognized immediately. The precision of someone trained by military discipline, where the way you fold your clothes is a small act with meaning. On the nightstand, beside a small lamp and a half-finished book, was a small wooden box. Unlocked. Unassuming. I opened it. The metal ring. I picked it up and looked at the symbol on its face for the first time from close, within inches in the afternoon light. The eye in the vertical blade. The small etched lines surrounding it, detailed enough that it had clearly been made by a skilled craftsman, not a simple piece of jewelry. I put the ring in my pocket. No conscious decision. My hand did it before my mind could ask why. I have learned to trust actions like that. On the wall of the bedroom, 3 photographs. Grandmother Martha young and radiant. My father as a boy of about 10, standing with a bicycle and grinning. And the 3rd photograph. Black and white. I took it down and looked closely. 4 men standing before a military aircraft. Uniforms with no insignia I recognized. None of them were smiling, but not because they were unhappy, because some moments are too serious for smiling, and this was one of them. The man on the far left. Young, early 20s. Dark hair. Posture upright with the bearing of someone who had learned to stand straight not for appearance but because it meant something. And the eyes. Even in the faded black and white, those eyes, I recognized them immediately. Pale blue. looking toward something distant. The eyes of my grandfather when he was young. On his hand, even in the blurred photograph, the ring. I turned the photo over. Pencil. Small handwriting almost faded away. Never forget. R. 3 weeks after the funeral, I returned to duty at Camp Pendleton. I wore the ring. Not by any deliberate decision. I put it on each morning the way you put on a watch, as though it had always been part of leaving the house. I wore it to the annual awards ceremony, dressed in full uniform under the bright lights of the base hall, and I wasn't thinking about the ring at all when I felt someone watching me. I scanned the room and found the gaze of a man standing across the hall. Tall. Salt and pepper hair. Army dress uniform with ribbons stacked deep on his chest. A general's star. And he was looking at my hand. The ring. His expression, I had studied faces for years, learned to read what people don't mean to show. What crossed his face in that moment was something I didn't have a category for at first. Not just recognition, but recognition the way a locked room feels when someone puts the right key in, like something sealed for a very long time was suddenly opening. He came straight across the room toward me. Staff Sergeant Whitaker? He read my name tag. Yes, sir. Major General Michael Kingsley. His eyes hadn't left the ring. That ring, who does it belong to? My grandfather, sir. He passed away last month. His face changed. Not in a simple way, as though several layers of emotion were moving through simultaneously, and none of them could finish before the next arrived. I saw something that looked a great deal like pain. Not the pain of someone hearing bad news, but the pain of someone hearing a confirmation they'd been afraid to receive. What was his name? Edward Whitaker, sir. 5 seconds of silence. 10. I counted. After the ceremony. My office. General Kingsley's office at Pendleton was less impressive than I might have expected for a man of his rank. A standard room, a desk buried in real working papers, maps on the wall with more pinholes than pushpins, a bookshelf arranged not by height but by some other logic I couldn't read. He sat behind the desk and looked at the ring I had placed before him. A full minute passed without him speaking. Then he picked it up. His hand trembled slightly, the kind of trembling someone tries to suppress and nearly manages. His thumb traced the symbol on the face of the ring, the way you touch something familiar you haven't touched in a very long time. I know this ring, he said. His voice was low and deliberate, each word measured. I know this symbol. I know the people who wore it. He set the ring down and looked directly at me. Who was your grandfather to you? He was just my grandfather, sir. An ordinary man in Ohio. I paused. Or that's what I thought. He nodded slowly, stood, walked to the filing cabinet, opened the bottom drawer, and removed a thick gray folder. On the cover was a red stamp I could partly read before he set it face down. Sit down, Staff Sergeant Whitaker. I sat. What I'm about to tell you, he began, remains partially in a sensitive category, but parts of it have been declassified, and I have authority to share it in a case like this. He looked at me. And I believe you have a right to know. Your grandfather is gone. There is no one left who needs to be protected by this silence, except the still classified files that concern third parties. Third parties. People who were saved. People still living. Or their children. He paused. We'll get to that. First, the ring. He opened the folder, found a page, turned it toward me. Printed there, enlarged and clear, was the symbol from my grandfather's ring. This symbol is the identifying mark of a Special Operations Detachment, he said. The unit's official designation appears in no publicly accessible document. Internally, it was known as Detachment Gray. He watched my face to make sure I was following. Detachment Gray operated from the early 1960s to the late 1980s. It was not conventional SEAL, not conventional Delta Force. It was a unit that operated in the spaces where named units could not legally, diplomatically, politically. I listened without interrupting. They carried out missions the government could not acknowledge. Not because those missions were wrong, but because in the context of the Cold War, admitting such operations existed could produce diplomatic or military consequences that no one wanted. He turned to the next page. Edward Whitaker joined the unit in 1962. He served 23 years. 23 years. In that time, he participated in at least 17 documented operations, And I emphasize documented because I believe the actual number may be higher. Most of the files on those operations remain classified. But what I have access to, he placed his hand on the folder, is enough for me to tell you one thing with certainty. Your grandfather saved more lives than most people do across an entire military career. The room was completely silent. The sound of the air conditioning. The distant sounds of the base outside. Why couldn't he tell anyone? My voice was calmer than I expected, because that was the condition of service. Not just during active duty. Permanently. They signed lifetime non-disclosure agreements. Not to family, not to close friends, not to anyone. Because in many of those operations, the identities of the people rescued, the intelligence networks protected, the covert channels maintained. If any of it leaked, even a fragment, it could endanger lives still being lived. He held my gaze. And even when that direct danger no longer existed, the government had no appetite for acknowledging that such operations had ever happened. So he spent his whole life being seen as a failure by his own family, I said. Not a question. I know. Kingsley's voice went softer. That was the price. And he paid it. Not because he had no choice. There were ways, limited as they were, to say something to family without fully violating his oath. But I believe he had decided, if you make a commitment, you keep it completely. In the weeks that followed, General Kingsley helped me access the portions of files that had been declassified. I read them at night in my quarters by desk lamp with a cooling cup of coffee. The language in the files is bureaucratic, dry, stripped of human weight, written to minimize persons and maximize data. But I had learned to read between those lines. 1964. Southeast Asia. Edward Whittaker was 23 years old. The file described it as recovery of detained personnel in denied territory. Between those neutral words, the actual story. A network had been blown. 5 people, 1 CIA officer and 4 local nationals working with the American side, were being held at a site near a contested border. The window to act was closing. Detachment Gray sent in 3 men. One of them was Edward Whittaker. They entered at night, located the detainees, began extraction. 200 meters from safety, they were detected. In the ensuing firefight, someone had to stay back to cover the withdrawal. The man who stayed, Specialist Raymond Okafor. He did not come out. 5 people reached safety. 1 American remained in the dark of that border region. Permanently. I looked at the name Raymond Okafor and thought of the black and white photograph. The penciled words on the back. Never forget. R. Raymond. Raymond had written on that photograph before the mission began. Or before he knew he wouldn't be coming back. And he had left it for Edward. And Edward had kept that photograph on his bedroom wall for more than 50 years. Never forgetting. 1971. Eastern Europe. 8 days. An operation to move a high-priority asset across a heavily controlled border. The asset was a German scientist being hunted by Soviet intelligence. Edward Whittaker, now 30, led the small group. The file has a handwritten note in the margin, added clearly after the original report. Someone's afterthought recorded in pencil. EW, decision on day 6 to alter extraction route, contrary to original plan, prevented contact with enemy forces. Correct call. Correct call. Written in pencil in the margin of an official document, as if the person who wrote it knew it would never receive formal recognition but needed to be recorded somewhere, in some form. The scientist went on to work at an American research institution. His name appears on dozens of peer-reviewed papers. He received awards. He was recognized. The name Edward Whittaker appears in none of those acknowledgments. 1979. The Middle East. Most details still classified. But the number I was allowed to see. 47 people evacuated from a conflict zone in 48 hours. 47 people. I stared at that number and tried to picture each face. I couldn't. I could only imagine the mass of them, men, women, children, people running in darkness, people who never knew the name of the man who led them to safety. 47 people who made it home. 47 families that stayed intact. 47 lives that continued. Not one of them knew the name Edward Whittaker. 1983 Central America. This file had a passage the censors had missed. A few sentences about a decision made in the field, when there was a choice between completing the mission's primary objective and protecting uninvolved local civilians. Edward Whittaker, now 42 and the senior man in the group, chose the civilians. The mission objective was not fully achieved. The file recorded this decision neutrally, without praise or criticism. But I read between those lines too. I understood that this choice likely had consequences for his standing within the unit, possibly the reason his files became sparser after that year. He chose people over the objective, and he never had the opportunity to explain that choice to a single member of his family. 1985. Eastern Europe. The final documented operation. I read this one 3 times because I wasn't sure the first time I had read it correctly. Midway through the operation, he discovered intelligence about a planned attack on civilians. His orders did not authorize intervention. Intervening would compromise the mission. He intervened. The attack did not occur. The mission was nearly blown. He and his group had to extract through a secondary route under high-risk conditions. The official file recorded this as exceeding mission parameters, with a note, incident under separate review. I don't know what that separate review concluded, but I know that Detachment Gray was officially dissolved in 1987, 2 years later, and Edward Whittaker returned to Ohio and lived the rest of his life in a small house with an overgrown backyard and a worn armchair. No explanation. No defense. Never telling his family a single word. General Kingsley brought me something on our 3rd meeting that I hadn't expected. When Detachment Gray dissolved in 1987, he began, each member was asked to write a letter. Not an official report. Not a handover document. A personal letter for themselves to read on the day they left the unit, or to leave for someone to find later. He looked at me. Most were destroyed at the writer's request. A small number were preserved in a private archive by the records officer at the time. And my grandfather? He slid an envelope across the desk. The envelope had gone pale yellow with age. On the front, in handwriting I'd never seen but recognized immediately as my grandfather's, Edward Whittaker. 1987. No address. No return address. The records officer then was a man named Harris, Kingsley said. He had served under your grandfather in the 1971 Eastern European operation. When I asked him why he had kept this letter when so many others were destroyed, he said, because I read it. And I knew this letter needed to be read by someone. I didn't know who. I didn't know when. But it needed to be read. I held the envelope. Have you read it? I asked. No. He shook his head. It wasn't mine to read. But now it's yours. I read the letter alone in my car in the base parking lot. As the sun finished setting, I sat with the envelope on my lap for almost 10 minutes before I opened it. The handwriting was upright, unslanted, without flourish. The handwriting of someone who had learned to write clearly as a deliberate skill, not for beauty but for precision. I read, I don't know who will read this letter. Maybe no one. Maybe I'll burn it before I go. But I'll write as though someone is reading, because that's the only way to write honestly. Today is my last day as a member of this unit. 23 years. I cannot say I didn't know this day would come. I have always known that everything ends, including the things that matter most. I cannot say it doesn't hurt, it does in the way it hurts to leave the place where your real life happened. But I have no regrets. That doesn't mean 23 years was without moments I wish I could change. There are. 1964 Raymond. I will carry that until the day I die. I will always ask whether there was something I could have done differently to bring him home. I don't know the answer. I probably never will. But I don't regret the choices I made. Every time I stood at a crossroads and had to choose, I chose according to what I believed was right. Not always following orders. Not always following the plan. Sometimes against both. But always according to what I believed. The greatest consequence of those choices was not the physical wounds, they heal. Not the difficult memories, a person learns to live with them. The greatest consequence was silence. Silence with Martha. The woman I loved more than anyone in the world, who waited for me many times without ever knowing where I was or what I was doing, who looked at me with eyes full of questions I could never answer. She never pressed after it became clear I wouldn't speak. She loved me enough to accept that. I didn't deserve that acceptance, but I have been grateful for it every day of my life. Silence with Robert, my son. He grew up watching his father leave and return without explanation, and he learned to interpret that in the wrong ways. I could see it happening, watching him measure me by standards I couldn't meet because my actual standards weren't visible to anyone. And I couldn't explain. I could only hope that somehow, in some way I can't foresee, he would understand. What understanding might mean, I'm not sure. Maybe only recognizing that my silence wasn't indifference. Maybe only knowing that I wasn't the failure he believed. I don't need him to honor me for what I've done. These things were not done for honor. I only want him to know that I did not live my life in vain. There are things that cannot be written into official history. Not because they don't deserve to be, but because writing them down would endanger people still living, and the living matter more than history. That doesn't mean they didn't happen. That doesn't mean they don't matter. If anyone were to ask whether I would do it again, I would say yes. Not because it wasn't painful, but because Raymond deserved that pain. Because the 5 people who came out of that place in 1964 deserved it. Because 47 people in 1979 deserved it. Because all the faces I cannot name but have never forgotten, they all deserved it. The value of what I did is not in whether it was recognized. It is in the fact that those people got to keep living. Raymond, if you are somewhere and can hear this, I never forgot. I carry that last nod of yours with me every day. You were the bravest person I ever knew, not because you weren't afraid, but because you were afraid and you nodded anyway. I hope when my time comes I can nod like that. Edward. P.S. The ring. I will wear it to the last day. Not to remember myself, but to remember everyone else. I sat in the car for a long time after I finished reading. The sun was fully down. The parking lot darkened. A few people walked past. No one looked at my car. No one knew that inside, a person was sitting with an old letter and feeling the world recalibrate around them. I thought about my father. The way he had looked at Edward. Never had a real job. Don't know what he did with himself, but he's fine. I thought about Edward sitting at the head of the Christmas table, answering polite questions with short answers, looking toward something distant in a way that I now understood. He was looking at things no one else at that table could see. I thought about Raymond Okafor, who had nodded in the dark of a border region in 1964 and never came home, who had written never forget before he went. Edward had not forgotten. 23 years serving. More than 30 years living quietly in Dayton. Dismissed by his family, misread as a failure, overlooked in the polite obligation of holiday visits, and through all of it, wearing the ring. Remembering. I called my father that night. Dad, I need to come home. I need to talk to you about Grandpa. What about him? He's gone. Not what about him. About who he was. A pause. What did you find? I'll be there this weekend. I need to say this in person. I sat across from my father in the living room of the Columbus house where I had grown up, with the ring, the black and white photograph, copies of the declassified files, and the letter arranged on the coffee table between us. My mother had come out of the kitchen when I started talking and had sat down beside my father without a word. I told them everything. Detachment Gray. 23 years. Raymond Okafor. 47 people. The scientist from East Germany. The 1983 decision when he chose civilians over the objective. The letter from 1987. I spoke for more than an hour. My father didn't interrupt once. My mother began crying somewhere in the middle. Not audibly, just tears moving down her face that she didn't wipe away. When I finished, the room was silent. My father looked at the black and white photograph on the table. Looked at the young man standing before the aircraft, straight and unsmiling and looking directly into the lens. Then he said, I didn't know. I know, Dad. If I had known, what would you have done differently? I asked. Not as an accusation, I genuinely wanted to know the answer. Would you have visited more? Talked with him more? Actually tried to understand him? My father was quiet. In that silence there was the answer. Not certainly. Not with confidence. Not because my father was a bad person, but because we tend to need reasons to look at people differently. We need evidence. We need to be told that this person deserves our time and attention. And that, I thought about this for a long time afterward, that was perhaps the real problem. Not cruelty. Not carelessness. But a way of seeing people that demands visible proof, and Edward Whittaker had none of that kind of proof. My mother picked up the photograph. Looked at the young man's face. Her fingers touched it gently. "He looks like your father," she said. I looked again. She was right, the way my father held his shoulders when he sat, the particular stillness of his mouth when he was thinking seriously. Those things were in the young man in the photograph. My father looked at the image in silence. Then he said in a voice quieter than I had ever heard him use, "He never told me anything about his past." I asked once or twice. He didn't answer. I thought he didn't want to talk. I never thought he couldn't. No. The difference between those two things. He stopped. That difference matters. Yes, Dad. It does. My father was the one who called me 3 days later. Linda. His voice was different. Not the voice of someone managing a situation, but the voice of someone who had woken from a long sleep and was looking around with new eyes. Yeah, Dad. I want to hold a second service for him. Do it right this time. A silence. I need your help. The second memorial for Edward Whittaker was held on a January afternoon, cold, but with winter sunlight, the thin low-angled light of Ohio January that makes everything look like an old photograph. Not 7 people. General Kingsley came in full dress uniform. He brought 2 others, former detachment Gray members still living, men in their late 70s who stood with a straightness that remembered decades of discipline. Francis Tran, I had learned the felt hat man's name, was there too, standing this time among the group rather than at its edge. Old neighbors. More neighbors than had come to the first service. And the son of Edward's chess-playing neighbor Carl, a man named Marcus, 45 years old, who had driven from Cleveland. Before the service began, Marcus found me and my father. "I didn't know what your grandfather had done, what you told me on the phone," he said. "But I want to tell you this." He looked at my father. My father had dementia in his last years. Your grandfather came to play chess every week and never missed a single visit, even when my father could no longer remember who he was, even when my father called him by someone else's name. He still came, still sat down, still played. Marcus paused. I asked him once why he kept coming when my father didn't recognize him anymore. He said, "He still recognizes the board. That's enough." My father looked at Marcus and couldn't find any words. General Kingsley spoke briefly. He didn't give operational details, not the place, not the time. He said only what he could say, that Edward Whittaker was someone he had known through reputation before he knew him in person, that in the circles of people who do unnamed work, his name was spoken the way you speak of something you believe in, and that when he had first seen the ring he had wanted to stand at attention. He stood at attention now. Major General Michael Kingsley stood at attention before the grave of Edward Whittaker, a retired man in Dayton, Ohio, with no medals on his headstone, no rank inscribed in stone, nothing to tell a passing stranger who he was. The 2 remaining detachment Gray veterans stood at attention too. Francis Tran stood at attention. Afterward, I stayed alone at the grave. The wind moved through the cemetery, lifting and settling the white flowers someone had placed on the headstone. The light had begun to shift toward evening, gold deepening to amber. I held the ring in my hand, not wearing it, just holding it, feeling its weight in my palm. I thought about all the years Edward had worn this ring, to Christmas dinners where no one asked what it meant, sitting alone in his small house with his pipe and his books and his silence, every morning putting it on as a reminder, not to remember himself, but to remember the people he had done everything for. To remember the people who deserved to be remembered. He had told me when I was 6. And I hadn't understood. I understood now. I put the ring on my finger. Heavier than expected. Or maybe not heavier. Maybe this time I was paying attention to its weight in a way I never had before. "Grandpa," I said, not knowing whether he could hear, not sure it mattered. "I know now. Not everything, much of it is still locked away and probably always will be. But I know enough." I stopped. "I know that you didn't live quietly because you had nothing to say. You lived quietly because you believed it was the right thing to do. And I know that kind of silence is far harder than being seen." The wind moved. Dad is trying to understand. He won't say that out loud. My father is not good at saying things like that. But I can see him trying. And I think you would be satisfied with that. The sky continued to darken. There is one final thing I want to tell. It happened 8 months after the second service. I had spent most of that time searching, not for more information about Edward, but for information about Raymond Okafor. General Kingsley helped me where he could. Raymond's official files were nearly empty. Like all detachment Gray members, he had been effectively erased from any traceable record. But people are not erased. Whatever the files say. I worked through the name, his home state, the small pieces of information I assembled from the files. Raymond Okafor. Born in Georgia. Enlisted 1961. For months of searching. Then I found them. His family was still in Atlanta. A niece, the daughter of his younger brother, named Nicole Okafor, 48 years old, an elementary school teacher. I called Nicole on a September evening. She answered after 3 rings. Her voice was careful when I introduced myself. Not everyone welcomes a stranger calling about a relative who has been gone for 60 years. I'm calling because I have some information about your uncle, Raymond Okafor, I said. Not much, many things are still sealed and may always be. But there is one thing I want you to know. A long silence on the line. Our family, she began carefully. Our family never really knew what Uncle Raymond did. We knew he went into the military and we knew he didn't come back. But no one ever explained. We didn't receive an official notification for years. When we did, it was just a few lines that said nothing real. I know. That wasn't fair to your family. No. Her voice hardened. It wasn't. I can't tell you the details of what your uncle did. The files are still sealed and it's not my place to overstep that. But what I want you to know is, someone remembered him. For nearly 60 years, someone remembered him. Silence. My grandfather, Edward Whitaker, worked with your uncle on an operation in 1964. Raymond didn't come back from that operation. I paused to give her time. My grandfather carried the memory of your uncle every single day from then until he died last year. He wore a ring to remember him. He could never explain to anyone why that ring mattered, but he never took it off. A long silence on the other end of the line. Then I heard her crying quietly as though she was trying not to let me hear. I'm sorry if I... No. Her voice broke then steadied. No, don't apologize. You don't know what this means to our family. A pause. We never knew whether anyone remembered Raymond. He has no medals. No official grave. No acknowledgement. To the government's records he barely existed. And we were afraid he had been completely forgotten. He was not forgotten, I said. Not by my grandfather. She cried for a moment longer. Then she said, What was your grandfather's name? Edward. Edward Whitaker. Edward. She said it softly, as though committing it to memory. Thank you for this. Thank you to Edward for this. My name is Linda Whitaker. I am a staff sergeant in the United States Marine Corps. I have served 8 years, been to places I cannot name, done things I hope were right. And I am the granddaughter of Edward Whitaker. That second fact, since I came to understand what it means, matters to me no less than the first. Perhaps more. Because the first taught me how to do hard things. The second taught me why. We live in a world that measures people by what can be seen. Not because we are cruel, but because visible things are easy to measure, and we prefer what is easy to measure. Degrees. Titles. Income. Property. The number of people at a funeral. Edward Whitaker had none of those things in the conventional sense. No degree on any wall. No title on any card. He lived in the smallest house in his neighborhood and walked to the grocery store. And across 23 years of service, he had saved people he was never allowed to take credit for saving, done things that official history will never record, held silence while being misread and overlooked, not because he didn't care, but because he had committed himself to something larger than his own recognition. I don't think he was a saint. He was an ordinary man with ordinary suffering, the suffering of someone who cannot explain himself to the people he loves, the suffering of someone who carries a friend's death in silence for the rest of their life. He made choices he knew would cost him, and he paid those costs. But he had no regrets. That's what I learned from the 1987 letter. No regrets is not the same as no pain. It means he had decided that other people were worth his pain. The ring on my finger now has the familiarity of something that has become part of you. I no longer notice its weight, not because I forget it's there, but because it has become as natural as my own hand. Sometimes people ask about it. I say, my grandfather's. If they ask more, I say, he wore it to remember the people who deserve to be remembered. And if they ask further still, Rarely, not everyone takes it that far. I tell them this story. What I think about most out of everything is a moment in a hospital room. My grandfather looked at me and said, "You're a good person. Not I'm proud of you. Not you make me happy." Just a simple recognition stated like a fact. And I said, "So are you." And he smiled. I think he had waited his whole life for someone in his family to say that. Not to honor him for what he'd done. He didn't need that. Just to see him. To see that he was a good person without knowing why, without visible evidence. I only wish I had said it sooner. Not when he was dying. But 10 years before. 20 years before. When I was a child climbing an apple tree, and he told me which branch to trust without asking why I wanted to climb. I wish I had stopped and looked at him and said, "You're a good person." The people who matter most in our lives often don't need us to know everything about them in order to deserve being seen. They only need us to actually look. Not to evaluate. Not to measure. Just look with genuine presence, genuine questions, the willingness to sit beside them, and let their silence be their actual silence, rather than something you need to fill. Edward Whittaker lived a life that mostly cannot be told. But the parts that can be told, the weekly chess games with a neighbor who no longer knew his name, the slow single nod when I said I wanted to join the military, the words calm doesn't mean not afraid on the eve of my departure, the 3 weeks in a hospital when only I came and he held my hand and squeezed it once, those parts are enough. Enough to show who he was. I only needed to learn how to look. My name is Linda Whittaker. And the ring on my finger, heavy enough to remind me, light enough to carry, is a reminder that the best people are sometimes the least visible ones. And that our work, the work of those still living, is to look.